So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar hosted by Obsidian and Ankura. I'm one of your co-hosts, Ben Johnson. I'll talk about myself in a second, but welcome. We're here to talk about SaaS security and what we're seeing out there, what's going on. Really excited to hear what Jason has to say around things like emerging threats and just kind of what should we be thinking about, right? So real quick, because we always have to do this, right, to give a background on ourselves. So I'm the CTO of Obsidian, Ben Johnson, and previously was the CTO of Carbon Black, the endpoint security company, and previously was intelligence community. So I really love security. I love dealing with different kinds of threats, or I should say I like helping to protect against threats. No one really likes dealing with threats. And love the community, right? Love the cybersecurity community. And with that, I've really enjoyed our partnership and our relationship with Ankura and especially Jason. Jason's been great. So Jason, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and welcome everybody. I appreciate everyone joining us today. My name is Jason Hale. I'm a director at Ankura working on cybersecurity investigations. I do a lot of cross-functional support here, so assisting the investigations team, incident response, expert services, but one of my focus areas has been on cloud response, and in particular SaaS. So helping clients more effectively respond and handle threats in their cloud environments and specifically within their SaaS applications. I've been with Ankura about a year and a half. Prior to Ankura, I spent about 11 years consulting in the digital forensics and cybersecurity space, doing a lot of endpoint forensics, advising, and expert work in civil litigation and other related matters. So excited to be here. Thanks again to everybody for joining. Back to you, Ben.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And hope everyone's staying warm. I know it's a challenging week for the majority of at least the U.S. A lot of weather and snow and everything, but hope everyone's okay. And with that, let's dive in. So in case you missed it, which I'm guessing you did not, really SaaS is here. I mean, we're on Zoom right now, right? A lot of our workflows, a lot of our day-to-day, business operations, our employees, our data, everything is really flowing through SaaS, right? Whether it's email, file sharing, video collaboration, whether it's our children attending school virtually, whatever it is, SaaS was already here. And then with all of the challenges of 2020, it only accelerated the remote workforce, the work from anywhere situations, the explosion of one office becoming 1,000 offices, that kind of thing. So SaaS is here. What we find, however, and a lot of I think what Jason does, but certainly a lot of what I do is talk to organizations about SaaS security and cloud security, is you really see a lot of times that the business of importance of SaaS is quite large, right? Every employee is getting their email. You have sensitive financial documents. You might have source code in places like GitHub or GitLab. You have all sorts of stuff that the business depends on, has really increased the importance and the criticality of SaaS. And yet a lot of times, because our security programs really grew out of on-premise network monitoring and host-based anti-malware and all of that stuff that we all were fighting with over the last 20 years, it means that SaaS is newer and a lot of teams are still trying to figure out how to approach it, right? From a security program, a security investment perspective. And my friend said this the other day, but I thought it was a great quote. So why not include it? Which is, SaaS is outsourced IT, but it's not really outsourced risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, with cloud security, there's something called the shared responsibility model. And I'm guessing a lot of you who work in security are familiar with this, or maybe very familiar with this. But a lot of people, especially outside of cybersecurity, aren't as familiar with this. And what it really is saying is that cloud providers are trying to take on some of the responsibility. For example, in SaaS, you're not really worried about patching, Windows or Linux or, things like that, because you don't even have access to the underlying operating system, but you still have responsibility, right? And so now you have this shift from you controlling everything on-prem and being fully responsible to now the provider being partially responsible and you being partially responsible. And a lot of times we see teams not really recognize that it is this shared problem, that even with SaaS, which puts the least burden on you, there's still a lot that you have to do, and that's really part of what we're talking about today. So, and I promise I'm not going to be the only one that talks. Jason doesn't get off the hook. He's gonna talk plenty. So we'll get to him in a second. But I think most of what we want to talk about today is our responsibility as users, or the procurers of SaaS, right? We're employing SaaS in our environment. But when you're looking at SaaS providers, I think it's important to quickly pause and think about what should you be asking these providers as you think about adopting different SaaS technologies, right? SaaS apps. And I'm not going to go into full depth. We could have whole conversations just on this topic, but you do need to understand what data are they storing, where and how is the data stored, who has access to the data. And then some of the questions I think are not typically asked as often as they should be, which is, for example, if you have a problem, like let's say you accidentally sent something extremely sensitive that should not be shared with particular provider, how would they help you? Do you have to just submit a ticket and hope and pray, or can you actually call someone? Will they delete their backups for you? Like some of those conversations I think need to happen, as well as things like, what are the built-in security controls? What access controls do you have? What security capabilities beyond access? Are there built-in threat detection capabilities? What's going on there? Does it have an API so I can pull data? So there's, I think, a lot of questions that are very relevant, and certainly these will come back to us in follow-up slides in today's talk. But you need to be asking these questions. And real quick, before I let Jason chime in here, we were looking at a provider, and we didn't even think to ask about multi-factor authentication or MFA, because to us it's such table stakes. Like, of course you have MFA, and then it turned out the provider didn't have MFA. They're like, no, we don't have that. We just have username and password, which is quite surprising, especially to those of us who work in cybersecurity. We learned our lesson, and we had to put another control in front of that to force MFA before you get into that app. So that's okay. It all worked out. But the point was, we didn't even think that was still a concern, and clearly it still is a concern. So just make sure you're asking the right questions. Now, Jason, I think, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that's a great example of what you just brought up with the MFA, because I think that represents the fact that so many of these questions are not top of mind when SaaS applications are going through the procurement process. In many cases, it's simply, does this application work? Does it meet the business objective, the need that we are seeking it out for? If you have application teams that are involved in the deployment, the procurement of applications and SaaS apps, the security considerations, whether it's even logging, whether that logging is enabled, where that logging is going, not to mention the API questions and MFA and the like, those are often an afterthought. And so in some cases, it's not until the application either is asked about during an active investigation, or it itself it becomes central to an investigation where these questions are brought up as to what logging is available and the like. So that that disconnect between, in some cases, between the application teams that were involved during procurement and the security teams that would want to ideally see things like MFA, see logging enabled and the like. Sometimes that disconnect can really be problematic in the context of a response.
Better said than I could. Thank you. But coming back to our responsibility, your responsibility, our responsibility as users of these products, I think something else that's not well understood, and Jason was just touching on this, is it's not just a shared responsibility between you and the provider. It's really internally a shared responsibility, at least most of the time, because a lot of times what you have is the application owner is the one that administers it, that sets it up for the business productivity, the policies around how it's meant to be used for the workflows. So you have that team or group, and that could be HR, that could be sales, marketing, whoever is managing that. You probably also have IT in the loop for maybe trying to connect that to single sign-on, or some of the more identity and access management teams. And then assuming that maybe security is slightly different than those IT teams, you have security trying to do threat management or understand risk and, kind of continuous monitoring and that kind of thing. So it really is a shared effort, which again, Jason was just talking about. And I don't think this is well understood, right? And if you take one thing away, I think one of the things to take away is that it is a team, team challenge, a team sport here, that it does have to be application owner, IT, and security working well together to really understand the risk and then hopefully mitigate those risks. So continuing on, SaaS, it is this giant interconnected web that's only continuing to get more interconnected, right? So you install these different apps, but then next thing you know, all these apps are integrated with each other, right? And it's affording us some great automation and workflows and efficiencies, but you start to get all these backdoor kind of connections where, all of a sudden all my data from Salesforce can flow to Slack or go to Gmail or whatever, right? And I don't think that's as well understood either in terms of, just the whole interconnected nature. Yes, we absolutely need to worry about users, user behavior, that kind of thing. But there's all these other ways that data can flow in and out, access can happen, et cetera. And if we step back, why is SaaS, maybe particularly challenging? Well, not just talking about the organizational challenges of multiple teams, but a lot of times these are always on, always reachable, right? So anyone in the world can try to log into your Microsoft 365. Users, right? A lot of times these apps have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users using them. Users are trying to do the right thing, but they might overshare or authorize that free chess game that happens to send all your Slack data to some foreign country. There's not a lot of expertise, as we talked about, because this is emerging. This is a newer area. We didn't all grow up defending SaaS, in 2000 or 90s or whenever, however old we all are. So it is a newer area. And then, a lot of times what happens is someone comes to you and says, I need access. So you just give them like an admin account, even though they probably don't need it. And so that increases risk, blast radius, et cetera. And then, as Jason was also talking about earlier, you have all these different, capabilities, different disparate audit logs, different formats, and we'll talk more about that as well. And if you look at some of these providers, they're telling you, like, you have to still do a bunch of the work here. You can't just like plug us in and think that we're going to do all your managed security. Like, no, like you have to make sure these aren't being abused. So, a lot going on here.
Yeah, and I think that word disparate there really summarizes so many of the challenges that we see in SaaS. If you have a typical user, right, if they have access to a dozen SaaS platforms as a part of their everyday life, as their everyday business, you can have multiple issues with that. So, if you're not stocking SSO or some type of federation on top of that, now is the user managing all 12 or however many credential sets? That's a nightmare from an end user perspective. But then, on the audit and oversight perspective, you have all of these different, this diverse ecosystem of SaaS applications that are each logging in their own way, or in some cases not logging, right? Each perhaps with their own set of credentials. And so, we find that really through conversations with executive leadership that this is a real concern for their teams. That not only the fact that you have these disparate applications that promote this interconnectivity, but also just the fact that there's currently really a lack of, in some cases, SaaS technical and management experience and just understanding how all of this kind of works together. And that's something that that's on the minds of leadership today through our conversations. And this is comparatively, as Ben was mentioning, it's a newer field of IT and IT security. We didn't grow up defending SaaS apps. And so as organizations continue to transition their application stack from on-premise to the cloud, this is going to continue to be something that is on the minds and a significant issue and challenge for not only leadership, but for funneling down to the security teams within the organizations. And so if we look at the next slide here, if you think about identity as a perimeter or the perimeter, this really kind of speaks to the massive change in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. Of you have organizations or companies that maybe they're considering adopting some cloud technology, some cloud native applications and the like a couple of years down the road. But in order to enable their remote workforce, they really needed to fast track that, and they needed to act on that maybe a little bit faster than they were planning on or would like to. And we saw a number of clients go through this as well, where you now all of a sudden you have to find a way to make sure that video conferencing is seamless, that you have remote users that who have traditionally accessed their environment using a network share in the local office. Now they need to have a way to share files with each other remotely from their own home. And so you really don't have to look much further than the Zoom stock from where Zoom was at the beginning of 2020 to the end of 2020 to see just this explosion and really how that kind of played out. And from a practitioner perspective, this is really the demand and evolution in how we go about things, and not just from 2020 and responding to the events of that, but it's going back to just the overall transition of enterprises and organizations from an on-premise presence and on-premise application stack to cloud. This has really transformed the way that we need to go in and approach these problems. Historically, we've been able to go in and say, okay, within the confines of your physical environment, what are the endpoints that are most of interest? What are the mailboxes, the logging sources, the network appliances, and the like? And while that's still important, now we have to consider what are the SaaS applications? What is the cloud presence of this organization? Going back to the network share example, if you have a company that's trying to move their network share that everyone accesses internally, if they're trying to move that to Dropbox to facilitate remote work, from a investigative standpoint, now we may not be as concerned with the Active Directory environment from a NAS perspective or from a network share perspective or the logging on the network share appliance itself. Now we need to say, okay, we need to take a look at Dropbox. We need to take a look at the audit logs and the access logs associated with Dropbox, which really begs the question of who owns that Dropbox and how do we gain access to that? And that's something that going back again to the ensuring that the application team is in close connection with security team in terms of understanding what logs are available and importantly, how do we gain access to that information? So when you consider beyond Dropbox, when you consider the other SaaS applications that may be at play here, understanding where that log information is stored and if it's even available. And unfortunately, in some cases, under default scenarios, you may have either logging disabled entirely, or perhaps it's not logging with sufficient granularity, right? So maybe you can't see exactly what files are being accessed, or you can't see what specific mail items are being accessed. And so just having a handle and understanding on that level of granularity and kind of where to look has really been a big part of this past year and even dating back. So if we look at the next slide here, if we consider what teams are doing, security teams internally, right? So within organizations, what are teams doing? And this really runs the gamut. I mean, it's anything from nothing, right? So it's been deployed, it works, it looks good, don't touch it. So that's we see that, right? That's an option. But oftentimes you have other teams that are trying to piece together some detection capabilities. So maybe it's pulling logs from Office 365 or somewhere and trying to aggregate them into some central source. Maybe it's a data lake, maybe it's an elk stack, and building their own detection mechanisms on top of that. Building their own transforms and the like. So we see that you have kind of an ad hoc security option where this is pretty common as well, where you're essentially taking advantage of all of the disparate SaaS applications and the functionality that they offer. So as an example, using Duo and trying to detect anonymizing IPs that are accessing the environment and taking advantage of things like conditional access in Azure or some of the alerting and detection mechanisms that Office 365 has in place. And so we see that quite often as well. And then you have organizations that are also trying to deploy vendor products like Obsidian to ingest the logs, to do some of those analytics, the correlation, detection, a lot of that hard work for you, so that you can kind of focus on what really matters here. But in general, we're finding this to still be a problem that organizations are trying to tackle. We're still trying to figure out, or they're trying to figure out how to best address some of these problems.
Yeah, it's great, and I mean I agree. We see everything, and I think the great trend is that CISOs or security organizations are saying the journey will end in SaaS, meaning they see the writing on the wall, right? Like none of us want to buy hardware anymore. If we can get away from managing even virtual machines in AWS or Azure and get to serverless and SaaS and that kind of thing, that's going to be a great thing. And so they are trying to figure out how to approach this. Now, with everything that we're talking about, I think it's important to step back just for a second and think about how you might structure your efforts, or think about how you talk to these other application owners, IT, other executives, etc. And I think it's about having like a simple framework where really what are you trying to do? You're trying to speed defenders up and slow attackers down. And then with these kinds of applications, a lot of what you're trying to do is also enable a larger percent of your population to use these collaborative tools or whatever. And so therefore you want people to be able to make safe, secure, good choices, have good behavior, and at the same time discourage the bad choices, bad behavior. So just sort of threw this in as more of a philosophical thing, but I think when you think about SaaS, part of what we're talking about here, and we're going to talk a little bit more technical here in a second, is we are trying to speed up defenders, like make sure people can respond and triage and correct and remediate faster, but you're also trying to slow down attackers, earlier detection, maybe some improvements that lead to less likelihood of threats in your environment. And then of course anything you can do to help monitor what users are doing to help encourage, create those teachable moments, etc. Like then that's when you start to create even more leverage in your environment. So I'm always a huge nerd for these kinds of things that help us communicate just security approaches, security programs, investments, that kind of thing. So whether you like this or not, I think the whole point is like try to condense everything we're saying down to something that can be communicated through the organization here. Now, getting a little bit more technical, what's the primary goal here? Well, a lot of times teams are like, well, first of all, I don't want the adversaries in, right? I don't want people from outside my organization, breaking in or getting in or whatever. Okay, cool. And then, depending on your priorities, this could be in whatever order you think, but you probably want to understand what's going on with your admins, your privileged users, that kind of thing. Because even if you have 100,000 accounts in one of these SaaS apps, you probably have 10, 50, something like that, admins. So it's a much more manageable, size of population. And then again, if these tools are used to store data, to collaborate, to share, you need to kind of understand what's going on there, right? Like, is everything just flowing out the door, or are you, kind of more well protected? And we're going to talk more about this, things like third-party apps and new user accounts, other ways that you should, keep an eye on your surface area. Like, are there, kind of backdoors being added and that kind of thing? And then if you have a lot of intellectual property, we do see a lot of people who care about insider threats. Other companies, if you don't have a lot of intellectual property, maybe you don't care as much. I think everyone cares, but it whether it's a big level of investment or not, that's something to consider. So, diving in, I think one thing to talk about is part of our, I think statements today is that a lot of teams are still trying to figure out like how to start. And so part of what we wanted to do is show you, like, even if you just have some of these SaaS apps, you haven't yet, figured out the overall strategy or how to approach this. If you start to dive into some of these native consoles, you can start to get some of this data, some of the logs that Jason's talking about, etc. So you can go in and you can see just who's logging in and that kind of thing. Now, one thing to call out is each one of these apps has a different level of sort of usefulness when you look at this stuff. So there could be good information like timestamps and IP addresses. However, does an IP address necessarily help you? Like, what state or country or whatever is that coming from? How did the user actually log in? That kind of thing. And when you start to look at these different apps, that's where, that's Microsoft, for example, G Suite, they'll at least tell you, like, was it a password used, SAML, etc. But you're trying to at least figure out, like, what are you working with when you start to think about, like, how do I do detection, or how do I understand, what's happening in this kind of environment?
Yeah, I think one of the common things that we see with these native consoles is that there's some context that can be lacking there, as you mentioned, some of the enrichment that could be done. But in other cases, such as Google's a good example, where the logging might be there, but it's spread across a few locations, right? So you have access logging over here, you have OAuth token authorizations over here. And if you're only looking in one spot, or you're only looking within one report or one tier of reports, it can be easy to miss other things within the native console. So it's understanding kind of where to look and the limitations of each. So it's a great point.
Yeah, and just to throw in one more example here, like, for example, in Salesforce, Salesforce has plenty of its own concerns, being a giant application with decades of engineering investment, so it's kind of grown organically. But they do tell you things like, hey, people are logging in, here's the cities they're logging in from, here's the applications they're using, that kind of thing, because context is really, really important. So if you start to get a sense of, like, what's being used and that kind of thing, it can be much more useful signal as you're starting to detect unwanted behavior and activity. And so if we wrap this up, and part of this is to go through a few different areas of consideration and what you might look for, and Jason's going to talk about some specific examples. If you just start with logins, like, if you're already doing all this, then some of the stuff we're about to talk about, I think, is great. If you're not really doing it, well, you can start with logins, like, who's even just accessing your SaaS applications, right? And again, if maybe you want to start with admins, you should have a much smaller percentage of your population is an admin account. So when are they logging in? Where are they logging in from? And then, are there very unusual login locations across the user population, right? We just had a call with a very big organization yesterday, and they said we saw some really weird locations in countries we didn't even think we should have anyone logging in from. So it really helped them identify some issues and go investigate, right? And then you're trying to get ahead of the problem too. So spikes and failed logins, or a particular IP address or country targeting a lot of users for credential stuffing or password sprays or whatever, just some things to think about. And then as you're looking at actual successful activity, is it kind of that whole impossible travel or atypical travel, like, hey, I see this person's at HQ, why are they logging in from this strange country? And some of that stuff's harder to do, and so you'd have to either invest time or use different vendor products, but it is good to really look for that stuff. Now, continuing on, it's not just about logins. You want to consider what's going on with privileged population users with particular roles, how that's changing, that kind of thing. And if you look at Microsoft, they do try to give you more context here. So on the right side, you see, some JSON data that's trying to say who did the action and that kind of thing. And the one thing I really like about looking for privileged population changes is that it's rare. Like, you should not be adding or removing admins very often. So therefore, I would say try to alert on that, try to do some detection on that, because that is a huge opportunity to at least dive in. And maybe it's legitimate, but it's a good opportunity to say, why does this person need to be admin? And again, maybe the application owner who adds or changes some of these roles isn't even in the security part of the organization. So it's kind of a good check and balance there. And if you look at something like G Suite, you can go in, you can see who's being created, added, removed to roles and that kind of thing. And you can even go into G Suite and turn on certain alerts. So you might already have some of these alerts that say, hey, just alert me when there's a new user that's been granted, privilege, that kind of thing. So I think, really just trying to figure out what you're working with, to start with. And then, as a summary here, like, think about, what are you looking for? New privileges granted, new admins, additional roles added to existing users. Why did that user all of a sudden need to become an admin? Again, this should be rare. So you'd get very interesting signal, right? Like maybe it's legitimate, maybe it's not a malicious act, but it should be rare enough that it's worth investigating every time there's privileges being changed, whether added or removed. And then there's other areas like new accounts being added that don't really map back to your source of truth, like an HR system, or someone has a mailbox and then they delegate access to another account. Now that account never has to log in as the C-level exec. They can log in as this other account and read all their email. And that tends to be something that's worth investigating. Again, it should be rare, but also we've seen that in attacks. And then finally, around access and privilege, keep an eye on those, more ephemeral type roles like interns, contractors, consultants, service providers, because a lot of times they're given like super admin or system administrator rights that are very privileged, and then they go away and their accounts stay after the fact, right? So, I think just keep an eye on that.
Yeah, I think one of the really important concepts to also understand and really keep in mind here is that it's not always just global admins and the super admins that you need to be concerned about. So a great example of that is application administrators in an Azure environment. So they have the ability to, as you might imagine, manage applications, right? So one of the management components there of an application administrator is the ability to change the privileges associated with an application. And what's really interesting here is that by design, they can actually, an application administrator can escalate the privileges of an application beyond what they can do in their role as an application admin. So, while they can't log into their account and perform certain actions, they can enable an application to do those actions. And again, that's as a byproduct of being an app admin. And so really, what that facilitates down the line, if you have an application administrator that is compromised, is the ability to for an attacker to essentially masquerade as this application with escalated privileges beyond the initial account that they compromised. And so, just ensuring that you have something, or you have the ability to detect and identify those types of events, again, not just with super administrators, but other types of administrators as well, is really key here. So, if we take a look at detection, in some aggregated data sets, and we'll kind of hit on a bit of this later as well within different subsets, but, this really looks at the idea that when events are aggregated, it's typically those that occur the least that can sometimes provide insight into threat actor activity. And this is really based on the idea that, in general, the attacker activity should be a small subset of the overall log activity, and often varying in characteristics than a typical user. So they would typically not be using the same IP, ISP, user agent, and the like as what you would see from a typical user. And so, one of the things that you can do is to find outliers in those fields. So IP addresses, ISP, which may require some enrichment depending on how you're going about that, or what native console or what tooling you're using. But being able to say, okay, what are the least common internet service providers that we're seeing hit this application? Not just IPs, but just let's generalize a little bit to ISP or user agents. And so being able to pivot on those types of attributes can help to, in some cases, identify pretty quickly anomalous activity. And this concept isn't new. In fact, we've been on the endpoint world. We've been doing this for years with things like prefetch files and registry run counts and the like. And so we're now applying those same type of principles to SaaS to try to figure out, okay, what is occurring the least in this environment in terms of IP and ISP and the like, and looking for that uncharacteristic, either maybe it's a spike in events or something along those lines to identify something that just looks a little bit off. And so this, I think the graphic here of the spike in events is a good indicator here, in that, if you're looking at events in aggregate within an environment, even if you're not looking at an IP address, you're not looking at a user agent, you're not looking at the type of activity, you're just saying, okay, let's take a look at how many event records are being created within this environment, given a baseline we have of a few weeks. And if you see something like this graphic where you have this massive spike, that's something that deserves or warrants a little bit of investigation, right? And there are plenty of benign examples of what this could be. Maybe this is a backup event. Maybe this is some type of syncing occurring. But the fact that this is this represents a huge spike in activity is noteworthy. And in some cases, it's this 10,000-foot view that such the spike really that can help us identify something that may not initially look or smell malicious. And we'll go back to an example of that here in a little bit as well.
Yeah, great. So just want to give you a little bit more beyond what I said and what Jason was just saying, and then I'll kick it back to Jason in a few slides. But it's not just about logins. It's not just about changes to privileges and roles and that kind of thing. You might also want to see what admins are doing, right? I mean, this tends to be interesting for detection of suspicious activity, but you might also have audit requirements, or someone's leaving the org and you need to see what they did in the 2 weeks leading up to that and that kind of thing. And especially if they had privileged access, it's quite important, right? So if you go into some of these SaaS apps, some of them try to make it quite easy to see that. So G Suite, you can go in and look at what the admins are doing. This slide's actually showing you Box and Dropbox. Now they record all the events and they have some good audit logs. However, you have to go in and you have to actually understand which events are the actual admin events, right? So it's not just an admin logging in and checking email or accessing a file or something like that. You're looking for the events that maybe require heightened privileges. And so sometimes that's one of the challenges where you have to go in and you have to figure out all this stuff yourself about which events should you care about and that kind of thing. So it's nice that the logs are there, but you still have to go in and start to figure out, like, what should I care about, and that kind of thing. So that's, kind of a pro and a con. The data's there, but you have to kind of spend some time understanding what you're looking for and maybe what might be relevant there. And then if you think about broadly shared files, we talked a little bit about this before, but it tends to be a concern for OneDrive, G Drive, Box, Dropbox, other systems like that. It's like, who's sharing information from the inside out externally, right? So for example, you can go into G Suite and you can look at visibility change from internal to external. Maybe that's how you're sharing with your auditors, your partners, your customers, or whatever. But often that's such a lower number than your overall usage of files internally in an organization in platforms like these, that you should be able to do some auditing or some detection of that when it's going, and especially if it's like publicly accessible on the whole web or something like that. That tends to be very rare, and you probably want to know about that. And then just kind of wrapping up this part of the section here, third-party apps, OAuth, that kind of thing around, these other ways into the environment. Someone's installed an app and get granted it certain permissions and scopes and that kind of thing. And so what does that mean, right? How can you go look at what's going on here? And I think we'll hear about this a little bit more. So, as a summary here, like, you got to think about what's being granted as people attach different, accounts or different third-party apps, that kind of thing, to your environment, right? Because that's literally changing your surface area. And then, we talked about this a little bit earlier briefly, but can you make it easy for the team to do the right thing? Well, can you, maybe do some configuration of making sure any shares externally at least have an expiration date or require a password or something, right? Now, it's better if you can set some settings and things like that to make sure that that's required, but at a minimum you should be monitoring or looking for instances of that, so you can go see if that needs further follow-up, or maybe it's an incident or something like that, right? So really need to think about that. And then again, I think Jason was talking about this before, but if you're an admin and the admin grants access to, maybe an OAuth app or third-party app, can that app now access everyone's mailbox or, something like that? So I think, really, really important here. Jason, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I would just say that sharing is one of those things that, especially external sharing, that it can be very difficult to pinpoint, especially if you're not sure what to look for, particularly in the native consoles. So sometimes it's that logging is there, but if you're if you're asked the question, what files are shared externally to the organization, depending on what platform you're in, that can be a difficult question to answer. So I think that's kind of a key area. But applications, you kind of get into the third-party applications a bit. The third-party apps really represent a huge risk right now that we're seeing in terms of not only attackers exploiting existing and new third-party applications within environments, but the organizations just trying to get a handle on what exactly it is they have in terms of application and what risk that does or does not present. So if we look at the next slide here, it really comes down to how well do you know your environment? Do you have applications that have unrestricted access to mail, as an example? Certainly there are plenty of examples that maybe they should have access to mail. Maybe it's a scanning for spam or phishing, or it's doing some type of kind of first level triage of incoming and outgoing mail. But if you do have those applications in place, really the next question you should be asking is, who can access those applications and how can they access them, right? So, understanding that if someone has access to a certificate or access to a particular token, they can access the environment as an application. And really, and the question you're trying to really get at in these scenarios is, under what circumstances could a person or an attacker with malicious intent be able to masquerade as this application? Because that's the type of thing that we're seeing, right? Where you have these highly privileged applications in the environment, you have someone that's able to access the environment acting as that application. They then have the privileges associated with that app, which in some cases, if it's access to all mailboxes, you now have a mechanism by which you can read data from all mailboxes that's not attributable necessarily in logging to your account. Instead, it's going back to that application that is making those API calls. And so that's really kind of a key thing to understand. And so when you look at, just detecting the events associated with privilege escalation of application and adding credentials and the like, that really becomes pretty key. And, so if we take a look actually at an example here, this was a case study here of where we were working a pretty large response and containment process where there's a pretty heterogeneous environment. You had a number of endpoints and SaaS applications at play here. We had some network monitoring in place. We had Obsidian deployed to monitor numerous SaaS apps within the environment. It was this was a G Suite or Google Workspace environment with Zoom and others as well that we were monitoring. And we were essentially working through the process to tighten the access control of multiple points within the network. So essentially, helping to enable MFA anywhere possible where it was not already deployed, enabling things like conditional access control and the like. And during that process, we through our really Obsidian monitoring, we were able to identify a really noticeable uptick in OAuth token authorization and API calls emanating from a third-party app. And so, if you think back to that slide a few slides ago, or the graph where it showed the spike in activity, that's essentially what we were seeing, right? We didn't know necessarily at this point what API calls this app was making, but we noticed that there was a noticeable uptick in overall events, and those events were these OAuth token authorizations. And so we dug into that a little bit. We tried to figure out, okay, let's first figure out what this application is and whether this is a legitimate or known application. So we had conversations with the security team, with the application team at the company, and we found out that yes, this is a legitimate application. It's known about. It's used legitimately, and the takeaway there is that we should expect to see legitimate activity from this application in the environment. However, in looking at this, some of the data points that we were seeing were still, we just couldn't account for them in terms of the reasoning behind them. So the infrastructure from which these API calls were emanating, we couldn't directly tie to the organization, and just the sheer spike in activity was notable. And so we took a look at some of the API calls that this application was making. And so if you, on the next slide here, Google, as an example, really does a pretty nice job of naming their API methods. It doesn't really leave much to guess here, right? So, when we take a look at what API calls this application was making, we can see that users.threads.list, right? So it's identifying specific threads within a mailbox. Messages.get, it's retrieving an individual message, and you can see an attachments.get. And through not only identification of infrastructure from which these API calls were coming, but also looking at what mailboxes this was accessing and what specific items this was accessing, we were able to pretty quickly identify that this was malicious. And essentially what was happening here is that the attacker was taking a very targeted approach to essentially seeking information that would help them gain access or regain access to other parts of the environment where maybe they were being locked out through some of these other control mechanisms that were being put in place. So on the next slide here, this represents, or this was a pretty insidious persistence mechanism in that, first of all, it leveraged an OAuth token for access, and so this was not something that utilized a typical username and password, which means that password rotations were going to be, we're not going to help here, right? A password change in this case would be like changing the lock on the front door, but this application was coming in through a side door, or anyone using this application was coming in through a side door. So MFA, any other access control that was applied to that front door was not applicable to this application. And so that really allowed this long-term persistence had it not been identified. The access here was also recorded in this OAuth token log. So if you were focusing solely on what user accounts are logging into the system, you would not have seen this. Right? This was in a separate log that was within Google. And luckily through our ingestion of all of those logs into Obsidian, this stood out as a spike, and it was really key here in detection, which ultimately allowed the client to go in and remove this application's access from the environment. But this represented kind of a key area of or a key win, in that case.
So I'll take the first shot at this, and Jason can add anything. But we were talking a little bit more about detection, and he just walked us through a very interesting case study. Of course, even more interesting when for him, I'm sure with the details, he had to kind of anonymize some things there. But there's a lot to think about, a lot to look at, whether it's logins, admin activity, the whole OAuth sort of movement, and we will talk about SolarWinds very briefly, but it played a part there. And so I think to you all, or to all of us, like, do we hunt through native consoles? If there's native detection, you probably want to turn it on unless it starts to spam you or something like that. But just how do you think about this more, kind of holistically? And I would say the number one thing that matters is to start doing something. It kind of sounds sounds dumb or computer security, cybersecurity 101 when you say you have to start doing something. But I think that is the challenge because of the, sort of internal shared responsibility, and sometimes security's not necessarily as involved in the equation or in the, kind of management of risk of these apps as maybe some other parts of the security stack and the tech stack. And then, to Jason's point, and I'll let him comment more, but, sometimes it's really interesting to, sort of sort and look for the least likely or the most rare events or attributes or that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great summary there, and that, just leveraging that fact that this attacker activity is generally going to be rare, relative to the population of your typical user activity. But in general, I would say just kind of piggybacking off of the doing something, start to develop a process that, of how you would detect these incidents, and find a tool that works for you. And ideally, that tool is going to enable you to be more efficient in that process. It's going to speed your process up. And so just start by working to develop that process.
Yeah, and then real quick on it's not just about finding, it is about response or investigation or that kind of thing. And I think we just have a couple slides here, and I'll let Jason talk maybe a little bit more on the next slide. But it's similar to other areas of your tech stack and your detect and response, your investigation, your triage process. You need to understand the situation first of all. Like, should I even spend time on this, or can I kind of close this alert or this ticket? But then with SaaS, it is a little bit different because you're not necessarily thinking about a binary or a host or some net flow data or something like that. You're thinking about, like, who is this person, what privileges do they have, what other accounts in these other SaaS apps do they have, essentially, to use the buzzword, like, what's the blast radius of this potential situation, what data is involved, and then kind of what actions need to be taken, or how can you do it, right? You need to think through some of the remediation workflows and that kind of thing. And so, wrapping up response, I'll let Jason talk in a second here, because this is what he does all the time. But again, thinking about just different mechanisms you have maybe to perform this. If you're using a native console, make sure you have access. Right? We already talked about how this is a shared responsibility. Well, we've seen teams that have to submit a ticket to get Office 365 logs like a week later from the IT team. Very, very inefficient. Also, to Jason's earlier point. And then I'll let Jason talk a little bit more, but just the whole, like, how can you get ahead of this versus waiting till the building's on fire to decide, oh, now's the right time to figure out incident response.
Yeah, I think just on that note, just understanding to the best that you can, understanding the logs ahead of time, so that the first time you look at Salesforce logs, it's not in the context of a response where it's high pressure, high quick turnaround. It's take some time to see what logs are being generated, and oftentimes those exercises, when they're done ahead of time, can not only help you understand the logging that's being generated, but also what's not being generated, and if there are certain knobs you can pull or turn, and settings you can enable to create some additional logging that may not be enabled by default. Office 365 is a great example of where in some cases access to specific mail items that are being accessed and the like, that logging for that may or may not be enabled by default, and that may vary based on your license level. And so just understanding what you do and do not have access to will really be key here. And so when you're faced with this response, and you have to understand, okay, based on this user privileges, what could they have access to? That will really enable you to more effectively respond and answer that question. And you'll know whether you have sufficient logging to answer the question, okay, this user account was compromised, what files were accessed, or what mail items were accessed. And so knowing ahead of time how to answer that question and what logs would be required to answer that question can really help you, particularly if you're looking at where there's health information involved, or PII, PHI, and the like. Understanding what regulatory considerations there may be in terms of ensuring that you can show what files were and were not accessed, and what potential consequences there are of not being able to show that. And so it's just thinking ahead, I think, is kind of the overall takeaway from this.
And we gave you some example logs down at the bottom to show you that they're all different, right? Salesforce, you have to figure out who this random user ID is. It's actually maybe a person, whereas other logs might have very good verbose, sort of JSON data, including maybe even geolocation of the, where the event took place and things like that. So yeah. And then I know we're almost out of time here, so we'll make sure we only have a few more slides here, but talking about the sunburst or solar winds type activity that was so sort of so visible in the headlines and everything over the last couple months. It wasn't just SolarWinds. I mean, SolarWinds was really a malicious DLL getting implanted, and then some pivoting to different parts of the organization, including SaaS, Office 365. But there was also a lot of other suspicious activity, or actually turned out to be malicious activity, where these OAuth applications were getting hit, including like Mimecast came out with a statement and a blog post and things like that. And there's more to it. It's not just them. There's others that have not come out yet. But just keeping an eye to some of the stuff Jason was talking about as well around, third-party apps. And I think Jason even has some comments here.
Yeah, I think understanding that you don't have to be a SolarWinds shop to be susceptible to this, and we've seen that, and that's something that CISA has put out as well, and that it's SolarWinds was maybe the initial identification of this, but understanding that just because you don't have a SolarWinds appliance doesn't negate you from being a victim here. And we're really seeing that these third-party applications are a pretty key component of this overall strategy, and the attacker's ability to maintain persistence in the environment. So leveraging the fact that you may be creating credentials and the like in these third-party applications to maintain that persistence, to use API access to go out and read mailbox data. And so I think that the takeaway here in terms of detection and response is really just to ask yourself, can you identify things like when a credential is added to an existing application, or when the privilege of an application changes or is escalated? And just understanding those indicators there can really go a long way in increasing your confidence level of this moving forward.
And we'll give you some, because we have not shared enough information yet. I'm obviously joking. We've probably, there's a lot of slides that you've just watched us go through, but might as well give you some parting recommendations. And I'll start, and then Jason can add some. I think you heard him say this too, but some of these SaaS apps, maybe the logging is turned off by default. So step one, go in and turn them on. Turn on logging, whether it's for detection or in case you need it later, or you might have some, compliance need or whatever it is. Make sure you're turned on ahead of time, right? It's kind of like turn the camera on at 7-Eleven before the robbery, not after, right? So go turn on logging and auditing. And then some of these capabilities, some of these apps do have native alerting. So maybe you can turn those on, right? Turn it on, see if it's giving you a good signal. Of course, try to understand what it's looking for, what it's trying to tell you. If it's flooding you, then, course correct as necessary. And then, I think one of the other challenges here is when people say, hey, I'm trying to figure this out. Well, they're also trying to figure out where to start. Because there's, I think the record I've seen is 800 SaaS apps in an organization, but there's probably a few that you really, really care about, like much more important than all the random, ones that are used by 3 people or one, there's still risk there, but the ones that are used by 50,000 employees and very sensitive data and stuff like that, so like figure out like which SaaS app to start with and maybe which area to focus on, like foreign logins, admin activity, shared files, et cetera, some of the things we talked about.
Yeah, and just considering the risk of if a particular application or the data within the application is compromised, or the confidentiality is breached, what considerations do you have? What regulatory issues might you face if that occurs? So knowing what you have and how you can respond if that information is exposed is key. Centralizing the data into a common location. So we talked earlier about pushing data into a data lake, or using an elk stack, or using something like Obsidian to do a lot of that detection legwork for you. Find something that you can centralize that logging for. We haven't talked about log retention very much here, but that's also a consideration in your native environments, and so that can help towards some of that. But really, you want to overall, you want to identify a process, right, and start to develop that process through incorporating tools, incorporating the steps that you need to accomplish that efficiently. And so, one example of a place you could start is just how can I identify administrative logins outside of the country where I typically see them, whether that's the United States, whether that's Switzerland. Start somewhere and then develop from there.
And I know we're basically out of time, but trying to map all this back to whatever framework you use. It could be NIST, it could be Cloud Security Alliance, it could be this quite simple framework. But how do you think about slowing down attackers, speeding up defenders, helping the overall population do the right thing? And I'll say that it's a real pleasure working with Ankura and with you, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's been great. Obsidian's been a great partner to Ankura. We've really helped helped a lot of clients through using this product, and it's enabled us to really efficiently detect and respond to threats in SaaS environments. Pivoting on IPs and ISPs and other key attributes that quite honestly would be difficult to do if there's not that kind of added enrichment. So thanks, Ben. It's been great.
And thank you all for attending. I know we ran over. Sorry we didn't get any Q&A time. We were just too excited to share all this information with you. But there's Jason's contact info. There's my own contact info. We've recorded this session, so it'll be available as well. And we look forward to staying in touch with everyone. So Jason, thanks again, and thanks to everybody.